This is Research Like a Pro, episode 202, Researching Scandinavian Immigrants with Jenny Hansen. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Hey everybody, welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi, Nicole. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you doing? What have you been working on?
Just finalizing plans for going to Sacramento for the National Genealogical Society conference. We're so excited to be finally going to a conference in person. I can't believe it's been over 2 years since we've been able to do this.
I can't wait. Yeah, I've been working on my research plan in the DNA study group, just getting all my strategy figured out, and now I get to have the next little bit to work on that, so I'm excited.
Yeah, it was a little bit more difficult making my research plan for this DNA project than I thought. I had to really think clearly about my objective and what records would actually get me to the objective because there were a lot of different paths I could take. It was an interesting experience to really think about what would be the best records.
So our announcements for today are just a reminder that our study group for the fall will begin registration this summer. So if you want to join us for Research Like a Pro, our study group, please check our website. And we're taking applications for peer group leaders. So we'd love to have you if you're interested in helping in that capacity.
Well, we're excited today to have our friend and colleague, Jenny Hansen, back. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, you guys. It's so fun to be here.
Oh, we love talking genealogy with you. So just a little background on Jenny. We laugh about how our paths have crossed and we didn't really connect for a while. She was teaching a series of Scandinavian research classes at our local church, and I attended all of those, and I thought she was amazing. She just made it so doable. But I didn't really, connect in a professional way, or I think I probably came up to you and said, "Oh, I really enjoyed that." But, when you're teaching, how many people come up and talk to you? Like
I
everybody says
know.
that.
Yes.
So I knew who she was. She really had no clue who I was. But at Roots Tech, I believe 2018 or 2019, we were both speakers as well
Uh-huh.
as Nicole, and we were all in line, I think, to go into the special speaker event. They have a special dinner.
Yeah.
And I just turned to you and I said, "You don't really know me, but I know you." And that was the beginning of our relationship. So it's been so fun since then just to continue working together. I work with Jenny on the ICAP Gen Commission. That's
Uh-huh.
our accrediting body. And so it's been super fun.
Yeah, I would just echo the same. I feel like I kind of knew who you were. And I think it was probably around 2019 that we got to be friends. And by 2020, that last time that Roots Tech was in person, the three of us were like hanging out whenever we could. And it's just fun to have friends who are genealogists. Like, I don't have a lot of my close friends that get this realm of my personality. So I just feel like it's a huge treat.
It is really fun being able to bounce ideas off each
Yeah.
other, the whole professional thing, as well as being speakers, at conferences. We
Yeah.
just have a lot in common. So it's awesome.
Yeah. It's super fun. Love these ladies.
Well, the reason we had you come back on the podcast, one is because we love talking to you, but
Well,
another reason
thanks.
is that we got a fun question from one of our listeners, and it kind of had to do with Scandinavian research, immigrants. So let me read that question, and then for this episode, we'll just kind of talk about some strategies that can help with this type of research. So the question is, I'm having a hard time going back further than my great grandfather on my mother's side. He's Norwegian, but spelled Olson, Olsen, instead of Olsen with an EN, like most from Norway. I found him in North Dakota in the 1880s. I haven't had any luck, unlike my Swedish ancestors, finding them in Norway. Do you have any advice? I can't find Mary and Ole Olsen in Norway and can't find their travels across America and settling in North Dakota. I'm almost ready to hire an expert to help me. Your podcast is excellent and helped a lot with my other ancestors, so thank you.
Okay, so Jenny, what are the first steps to take when looking for an immigrant ancestor?
Well, I think that a lot of us tend to say, oh, they're from Norway or they're from England or, whatever country. And we want to jump immediately into those records. But I'm sure your audience is very educated. They know what they're doing. But we have to remember to get complete US research before we make that jump across the ocean. So when we talk about everything, we may want to make sure you have any vital records for any event that happened here in the United States or wherever you're starting out your research. All census records available, any immigration records that are available. So, one thing that I learned a long time ago, like a very long time ago from Elizabeth Mills, was that we always start from the known to the unknown. And you have to remember that the past is a foreign country. So, you can't just assume that the way we live now and the customs and cultures that we have now always apply to our ancestor. We have to start out with what's most available and most accessible, and then make a trail going back from there. So I always tell people the first step is to make sure you've exhausted everything in the US.
Yeah, that's great advice. And another place where I've seen some hints to the old country would be newspapers. It's
Yes.
interesting what you can find in newspapers, or even things like county histories or
Yep.
little biographical sketches published in books. So I think once you have really exhausted the vital records, census, immigration, and you still have no clues, start looking outside the box.
Exactly. Make sure you have everything, not just the basics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like when you said all of the census records, and that reminded me of one of the first projects I did for a client. And she had all these sources attached to the FamilySearch tree, and some of them were New York State census records, but only a couple of them. So the first thing I did was just get all of the census records, and this person was an immigrant from England. And in one of the census records, it was every 5 years, right? So New York was on the
Mm-hmm.
5, and then on the 10 was the federal. So once all of those have been examined, one of them said the county in England that she came from.
See, that's the trick. You have to look for those little hints that come in unexpected places.
Right? And that she even had the record. She just hadn't looked at it closely.
Yeah.
Or somebody had attached it to her person in FamilySearch and she didn't really, because you can attach those without looking at the originals.
Yep.
So, yeah.
So interesting.
Well, a lot of times ancestors' names changed once they got to the United States. So, how do you handle that situation when looking for immigrant ancestors?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I thought of that, of course, looking at this question from your listener about the different spelling from Olsen to Olsen. So my last name is Hansen, which is the very traditional Norwegian spelling, Sen. But my maiden name was Peterson, spelled the Swedish way, Peterson. But we are Danish descent. So it should have been Pedersen. So I totally relate with this question. And I think that this is a really common circumstance, whether your ancestors have Scandinavian origins or just any European origins. We really see name changes happen a lot, usually around the time of immigration. Sometimes we want to blame that on the ship passenger list or say, oh, the clerk wrote my name wrong. Or if you guys remember that movie The American Tale about the little mouse family that immigrates as
Mm-hmm.
Jews, do you remember that?
Yeah.
And it shows the scene that Fievel and his family are all getting on the boat and they list off their big Eastern European last name, and the clerk says, okay, Mr. Smith. We want to think that that's how our names got changed, but really it's very seldom like a hard fast time that the ancestor switched to spelling or like we like to say, Americanize the name. That usually kind of happens as a process. So, for example, with my ancestors and the Peterson spellings being changed, I see them for like the first probably 20 years that the family's in the United States. Sometimes it's spelled the Danish way, sometimes it's spelled the Swedish way, and a lot of times it's a mix of the two. So I think the thing to remember on this is that our ancestors were kind of figuring out the process, and spelling wasn't as standardized back then as it is now. We all own our spelling. It's a very personal part of what our name is. But even 100 years ago, it wasn't that personal. And as long as it was kind of right or it sounded the same, then it was considered correct. So maybe the thing to remember on this situation with the name change of spelling with Olson is just, give it some grace in the records. Look at what anybody might have heard, and don't be too concerned if one time it's spelled SON, one time it's spelled SEN. When you get back to those original records, you'll start to see it more standardized for the country. But even then, you'll see maybe like OLESEN rather than just OLSEN. Spelling rules just weren't the same as they are today.
Absolutely. I think that's a common question about spellings and just confusion about why that changed. So thanks for all the ideas and explanations. That helps so much.
That really does. I'm sitting here chuckling because I have people in my neighborhood that are named Robinson and another Hansen family, and I can never remember whether their names are Ian or
Yeah,
Owen. And half the time I spell it wrong because I can't remember. So, can you imagine people who really didn't know language well? And
I know.
it's just tricky.
Yeah, and like I said, we take it as this big personal thing now, but it's really not not as intimate as we want to make it be.
Yeah. Well, to the name changes, my maiden name is Schultz,
Yeah.
and we spelled Shults. That name change for our branch of the family occurred in Tennessee in the 1800s. And so the original ancestor came over in the 1700s and was the, Schultz. But then it took 100 years and then they Americanized it more. So,
Yeah,
and then of course we still get the different spellings because people don't
of course.
know how we've changed it. So, very familiar with the name spelling change thing.
Yeah. I think the big tip for researchers is just don't freak out about it.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
okay.
It is okay. All right, well, let's move on and talk a little bit more about those specific sources. We touched on this, but we were just talking earlier about research planning, and I think it's really good to start with those records that are most likely, most accessible, and what would you do for a research plan? What would you do first?
So, if I'm looking at a Scandinavian immigrant, of course, the first thing I'm going to look at is the easy things like the census records, right? And like Nicole said, you might find some great clue in those that totally solves your problem. But then there's other times that we get the great clue of your ancestors' origins are Prussia, right? Like that's the worst thing to see because you're thinking, oh man, what does that really mean? So, cast that net broad. But then, as Diana's pointing to, you want to think of what's most likely to give me the best results. So, one of the great things with our Scandinavian ancestors is that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Scandinavia is one of those cultural things that they brought with them. And so when we have our ancestors, who most of them would have settled in the Midwest area, they still had these Evangelical Lutheran churches. And part of those church records, it talked about what parish were you most recently in before you came to this parish. So that can be a huge clue. And sometimes it would say Copenhagen, meaning, the ancestor came from their hometown. They were in Copenhagen for a little bit while they were waiting to immigrate. But other times it might give you the actual parish, like where they grew up, the hometown. That's a really good indicator there. Those church records are great. Another one, Diana, you kind of mentioned this, these local newspapers. A lot of times they would list, especially within these tight knit ethnic communities, they would list people who were coming in and joining the community. So it could say, Olson and his family from this place in Norway. That's a really good one. On that idea of newspapers, I had a huge success with a project like this just last month, where an obituary for this woman who immigrated from Denmark and ended up living in California for the rest of her life. In her obituary, it listed all of her living siblings with the residents in Denmark. So for me, that was a huge clue because I'm seeing the names of her brothers and sisters and the towns they're living in. So I had a great idea of what region this family was living in there in Denmark. And that was a really good spot to go and look at. Sometimes you'll see social groups like fraternal societies that are big in these ethnic communities. And if you can get records to those groups, which, it's kind of hit and miss what you might find, but that's another place to look, that it can tell you this whole group originated from this area in Norway. So there's some of the more public, broader records that you could find. If you're really lucky, your family's going to have things like journals or diaries or maybe letters to and from people back in their home country. And that is like a gold mine of information there. Kind of similar to that, my dad's grandfather, so my great grandfather was the immigrant ancestor on that side of my family. And he told everybody the name of the town he came from in Denmark. Everybody knew. Now, the tricky part of that was figuring out what jurisdiction that little town was from because some of these towns it's like 2 or 3 farms and they call it a town. So, having any kind of a location is going to be ideal. That's something we really need to have when we're jumping into research in a foreign country.
Oh, those are such great ideas. And I love that you found in the obituary the siblings,
It
which
was
really,
super
yeah.
cool.
So that just made me think, did people come and join their communities? So did we see chain migration where like a few people would come over and then some others would come from the same village and join them in the same place in the United States? Did that happen with this group?
Yeah, I think it did happen a lot with this group. And I'm not going to say that that's what everybody did because I can promise that's not what everybody did, but a lot of people did that. We see that throughout lots of different European communities that one or two families would come and then it's as if they were testing the waters for their friends, right? Or they kind of get situated and realize this is going to be a good place. And then you start seeing others come and join them. And that chain migration is a really good pointer back to a location within Europe.
Yeah, because if you can find, say, someone with maybe a little bit more unusual name in the city or the little farmland in Europe, and then they're in the same place in the United States, that can be really helpful, especially when you're dealing with really similar names.
Yes, yes. Well, and that's Scandinavia for you. Like everybody has the same names.
That is so true.
Right? With Mary and Ole Olson,
I
like our
know.
listener's question. It just makes me think when they, were found in North Dakota in the 1880s, were there any other people around them that were from Norway or Norwegian? And maybe following them back could give you some clues, right?
Yes, I totally agree with that. I think that we have to be willing to admit our ancestors are a piece of a community, that it's not just their story, but we're looking at the story of the community that they immigrate into and where they left and how all of this fits together. And that's one of the things that I love about family history and kind of how I got pulled into this. I love history and I love that looking at family history gives us a personal view. It just makes the stories of the world become very intimate for us and we can relate to them and we know this is how this event impacted me today.
Love that. Let's jump to talking about some immigration records. So I think a lot of the time we want to find that, awesome record that tells everything about where they came from and it's got a ship manifest and everything. So what can we in reality expect to find in different immigration records?
Well, I mean, we just described the daydream right there, right? We all want to have this record that's got a picture of the boat and it tells everybody who was on the ship and how they knew each other and what happened. But, let's face it, a lot of times immigration records can be really disappointing, especially if they're from that like mid to late 1800s. Like, I don't know. I remember so many times looking at passenger lists that just say these people all came from Germany. And you're like, really? I knew that. Or you think, I'm going to find this naturalization record. This is going to give me all my answers. And it just says that they are breaking their ties with the King of England. You're like, this does not give me anything that I want to know. So I think the first thing when we start looking at immigration records is we have to set an appropriate expectation and think, this time period, I might not find what I want. But other times you get really cool stuff. And it's always great to see your ancestor's name on something significant. So you always want to look for them. But I think we also need to realize there's a big difference between a ship manifest and a naturalization packet. So those ship lists in the more recent ones, like in the 1900s, that era when there was a lot of immigration, but sadly, a lot of our Scandinavian immigrants were before this time. Anyway, some of those ship lists are really great and you get relationship information and occupations and all that kind of stuff. But like I had just mentioned, a lot of times in the 1800s, it just is the name of the person and the country that they originated in. So the Shipless, while it's cool, it's not going to give you the meaty information that you're really looking for. The naturalization records, those are great. And we know there's multiple parts to the naturalization process. So finding that certificate of naturalization is probably not going to be the one that gives you the most information. If you can find a petition for naturalization, that's going to be great stuff. Naturalization petitions is where the subject of the record had to include a lot of personal information. Their place of birth, date of birth, parentage information is given, and that's where you'll find any relatives that they maybe were traveling to or with, ties to people back home. And again, it depends on the time period that those naturalization petitions were being filed, but some of them are phenomenal. I recently was, this is that same project I was telling you about, the obituary that listed all the siblings. We had a naturalization petition, and it had an actual photograph of the subject hooked onto that naturalization petition. It was so fun to see the cute young face of this young adult woman who was so excited to be starting out her new life. And she's telling us about the place that she was from and really great information like that. So, you know, like all records, you hope for the best, but you have to acknowledge that sometimes you might be disappointed in your record.
Right? I've seen some of those ship lists that are really helpful and some that aren't. And like you said, even though some don't say a lot about the origins of the immigrant, it's still helpful to see when they arrived and to see their name on a piece of paper and the people they traveled with. So hopefully, if it's not a super exciting record with a lot of details, you can still glean some clues and some indirect evidence to use later.
Yes.
I am just curious, and I'm sure other people are wondering too, where did you get that great petition with the photo attached? Was that a court record, or how
Yeah.
did you track that down?
Yep. Court record.
Nice. And that can be tricky because they could have naturalized in so many different courts. So you
True.
have to really cover all your bases there. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what to search for in the United States. So, how much do you need? What is essential before you actually start looking for the ancestor in Scandinavia?
So I feel like there's two pieces of information you really need to have. One is easier than the other, of course, but finding your ancestor's original name is a huge one. And like, I know we just had this big conversation about spelling changes and all of that, but if you know that Martin could be Martinez, that all of these potential name changes so that you're not so stuck to the Americanized version. That's the first one. But the second one, which I think is even bigger, and this one is, of course, much harder to find, you need a specific place of origin. If you have somebody that's from Denmark, well, Denmark is a kind of big place. If you say my ancestors from Norway, Norway's huge. So we've got to narrow that down. And if you can get clear down to the parish level, that's going to be the very best because that's the jurisdiction that most records are going to be organized under. I recently was working on a project where they said that their ancestor was from Copenhagen. And I always panic when they say they're from one of the big cities. You think, really? Or was it an area near there? And these records are huge. But I just did a census index search for Copenhagen. And sure enough, I found this man who had a very interesting name right there living in Copenhagen. So sometimes the big cities and the kind of broad ideas are correct. But if you can use these sources like we've been talking about to whittle that down and find the lowest jurisdiction possible, your odds of having success in finding that person are much, much greater.
Knowing that you don't have to know every single thing, you just get those clues
A
and
name
you
and a
get going.
place. Yeah, a name
Yeah.
and a place, and you can move from there.
Well, and you can estimate birth dates and you can estimate dates of parents. We talk a lot about creating a hypothesis when we do our research plan.
Yeah,
And you have to estimate because you obviously don't know, or that's why you're looking for them. But you can figure out some stuff. They're 20 years at least older than your research subject, those parents, and
yeah.
siblings could be around the same age within, 10 to 20 years. So you can do some good assessing of the situation and put on your thinking cap and see what you can find.
I agree. And that's just such a good rule of thumb for genealogy in general. We use our brains. This is a mental sport that we have to think what makes sense. If I sketch out a timeline of this family, does it all link together in a way that is logical?
Right. And when you come across people with the same name, can you get rid of them, get them out of the hypothesis because they stayed right there and they did not disappear? We
Exactly.
can eliminate candidates by researching them a little bit more, people of the same name that we find when we do this jump across the pond.
For sure. And I think, again, we talked about these areas where there's a lot of repeated names. We have to do a lot of eliminating candidates there. Like, that's to me the most interesting, exciting, challenging part of the work because if it's so easy, you're like, well, that was kind of boring. But if you, if you have three potential family groups that you're trying to decide which one really fits here, it's awesome. That's fun. That's satisfying.
Yeah, that's great.
Like a good challenge.
I
It
do
reminds
like a
me
good challenge.
it reminds me of when I first started researching and I would find a person who had a similar name and I could tell they weren't the right person. I would just be so annoyed, like, oh, this isn't, I'm not even going to look at this person. But now it's like, oh, like put them in my log and figure out who they
Yes.
are so I can, group all the records that belong to them and move those away from my person.
Yeah, I totally do the same thing, build out that family group for every single Hans Jensen and then try to decide which one is the right one, right?
Love it. All right. So we've got a pretty good background in what we need to have before we start looking for an ancestor in Scandinavia. So, what do you consult first when you're making that jump across the pond?
Well, the first thing, I think we all love our census records, right? We want to cast that broad net and we can see what possibilities are even there. Like I mentioned, I had this guy that I'm like, well, supposedly he's from Copenhagen. We'll just see what happens. And sure enough, it was correct. And I found that by using a census index. So Denmark has great census records. They're very regular. Norway only has them for some years. And in Sweden, we don't even get census records. And those are our three main Scandinavian countries. We can start pulling in places like Finland and Iceland and to make up that whole Nordic area. But if we're just talking Scandinavia, those are our big three. But in Sweden, they have different types of records that kind of substitute for a census, these clerical surveys that were part of the church records. And that's like another topic for another day, I guess. But cast that net broad on what kind of records exist that are a survey of the community. That's where I always want to start. And similar to that, I love the compiled databases. I used to drag my feet so bad about indexes for Scandinavia because it's really easy to get a lot of false negatives, like we were just talking, or false positives, either way, that if the spelling's not just right or, the birth years are off by a little bit, you're going to see so many people with the same name that are not your ancestor. It's just easy to miss people. So for a long time, I would just say, oh, I browse records. I'll only browse records. But now these indexes have gotten really good. They're improving with time and getting smarter, and the search engines are getting better too. So I'll get onto different websites like FamilySearch and Ancestry and MyHeritage and use those indexes they have there to see what comes up. Just what do they have? What might match my ancestor? And a lot of times I'm finding great stuff these days. And again, it doesn't just pop up and say, this is your ancestor with flashing green lights, right? But it gives me enough clues that I can use my brain and deduce, is this the right person? Is this not? And kind of keep track of all those records and create the picture of the correct person. So I love those. I love using the user submitted trees as well. I had a huge breakthrough with one of those recently where I had this great case of a family in the US and we knew they immigrated but didn't know exactly where to make the connection. And I thought, I'm just going to try the FamilySearch tree database and see. And sure enough, I'm looking at it going, I think that this tree on FamilySearch ends with the records in Denmark. And then we had built up the other half of the story in the United States, was able to link those two together and then get some great clues on how to progress into earlier generations by looking at a user submitted tree. So that was a really fun, validating experience to go, yeah, sometimes I can do half and the other half is already out there. Gosh, if I were to think of another one that people will really recommend are like the immigrant police records that have been created in the country of origin. I don't use those a lot because I find they're kind of centered in these big port cities where people left. And it's hard for me to know, like, how long was the person living in Oslo or in Gothenburg or, these places, these bigger cities where our ancestors shipped out from. And it's not that I neglect those records. I just haven't had much luck using them. But I know other people who swear by them and say, oh, those police records are so great. So that's another one where it's kind of a hit or miss. But if the records are there, and now we can search for so many of these things just with online indexes. So, I mean, it's always worth giving it a shot. What are you out?
Mm-hmm.
5-10 minutes of trying. And if you're not finding anything quick, then move on to something else. Or maybe you're getting some great hints and you want to dig a little deeper. So, some ideas.
Those are all great ideas, and it's a beautiful thing to be able to quickly search an index to see if you get any hits, and then
It
don't have
is.
to spend too much time on it.
It is. And sometimes I wonder, are these indexes going to put me out of a job? But then I remind myself, no, because I know what to do with them.
Right? So true.
Yes, we have to use our brains, and
We
we use
do.
logic. It is like putting together a puzzle. You have all the pieces, the indexes throw out the pieces of the puzzle, but man, fitting those together to make something that makes sense really takes a human being. So you'll never be out of a job.
I know. I'm like, there's a reason they're not paying monkeys to do this.
Yep. Well, we have talked about a lot of fun things, but to kind of finish up, what are some specific resources for those looking for Scandinavian ancestors?
Oh, that's a great question, and actually a good one to kind of wrap up with, too. So, I think that when we talk about our Scandinavian ancestors immigrating to the US, chain migration is huge, like we talked about. And there were kind of two big groups of Scandinavians who left and resettled here in the United States. So, the biggest, of course, all through the Midwest, we see, even up into the Canadian Prairie and down through the Great Plains area of the United States, we see a lot of Norwegian and Swedish and Danish immigrants settling in these towns all through there. But another big wave of Scandinavian immigration happened with those who joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So in the mid 1800s, there was a big wave of generally poor farming families from Scandinavia who came and settled in the Rocky Mountains. And so we need to be able to identify, are we looking at this Midwest pioneer group, or are we looking at the Rocky Mountain LDS group? So within those two different groups of immigrants, we're going to find some different resources for looking at our ancestors. Of course, those in the Rocky Mountains, you're going to find a lot more in terms of things on FamilySearch and LDS records that have been created to support those groups. A lot of community histories for these farming towns that were settled by Scandinavian settlers. But when we look at the Midwest groups, we've got some really great resources there too. There's now some different heritage centers that are set up to help research and understand the experience of these Scandinavians who settled in the United States Midwest area. So one of the big ones, like for Denmark, there's the Danish Immigration Center, or Danish Immigration Museum, I think is actually what it's called, and that's in Elkhorn, Iowa. And they just have access to so many great resources and researchers there who can help you because they specialize in doing this cool thing. There's another group called the Forest Finns. They were an early immigrant group to the US that were ethnically Finnish, had a lot of ties to Sweden, and then set up these colonies like in Delaware, which I know that seems weird and you think, what a niche group. But there are a lot of people who can trace their ancestors back to the Forest Finns. So you might want to look for different resources that affiliate with the specific ethnicity that you're researching. I hope that that makes sense. Just realize that there's a lot of groups here in the United States that specialize in immigrant ancestor origins for that ethnicity. Another thing that I will shout this from the rooftops to everyone I talk to. Those FamilySearch wikis, I think they get overlooked by so many people, but the FamilySearch wikis have pages all about immigration from different regions. You can find them for Norway, for Sweden, for Denmark, for Spain, for Italy, all of these different areas that our ancestors came from. The FamilySearch Wiki has pages telling us, look at this kind of record, check with this group, look at these newspapers. Like, there are just fantastic advice and research tips on those FamilySearch wikis. So hopefully that gives people some ideas of places that they can look when they're really getting going.
Oh, yeah. I recommend those all the time.
Yeah,
And I think sometimes we just forget about them.
we do.
But those wikis, I mean, you are really good friends with the people that write those
I
wikis.
am. I have some ties. Plus, I love the wiki myself. Before I even knew that these friends of mine were running the wiki, I thought this is a great resource. So, yeah,
Yeah, it's great. And it is exciting. It's such a fun time to be researching.
I agree.
I am really quite blown away by the resources that just keep coming for us to use.
Yeah.
There's never been a better time to research than right now. And I know we did a project for a Swedish ancestor for a client, and there was a great Swedish center that we
Yeah.
wrote to for records, and they did a lot of work for us. I mean, it was amazing to see what is out there.
Yeah. And, we can't just limit ourselves to what's available to us on our home computer. I mean, we're lucky that there is so much available there, but looking at some of these outside resources can really point us in helpful directions too.
Yeah, I think it really speaks to using the power of the internet to connect with people who can help us.
Yeah.
I mean, that is another thing we need to think of besides Ancestry and FamilySearch and our big databases. How can we use the internet to find that local researcher or to find this repository? What else can we find? And it's never been easier. My mom would write letters
Yes.
upon letters in the 1970s and have to wait for a response to get somebody to go look at a cemetery for her. And now it's so much easier to find people to help.
I remember writing letters in the 90s when I was doing this. So that's like not been that long ago that was the way of the dodo, right? That we had to find somebody and hopefully grease the wheels enough that they're willing to look at things for us. And now there's just so much connectivity going on with the great communities that we have available online.
Yeah. Facebook groups are something we haven't talked about, but there are Facebook groups, I'm sure, for every one of these countries.
Yeah.
So fun to think about this. As we've been talking, I looked up my Danish ancestor. I have a second great grandfather who was part of that Rocky Mountain group that
Uh-huh.
joined the LDS Church. And, so many great sources on FamilySearch have been put up by his really close descendants. I'm just kind of blown away with how much is there. It's
Yeah.
always great when you find a line that you don't personally have to research because someone else has done a lot.
I know.
So I haven't done a lot of my Danish side because I know there have been other people that have worked really hard on it.
Yeah, some of those lines that are very prolific that you just
Yeah,
think, I know somebody else has got this one covered.
yeah. I can work on my dad's southern lines where we have
Yes.
so many holes. So.
Well, that southern stuff is so hard too.
But we love it. That's why we love it, because it's
Yeah.
hard and it's a
Yes, I
puzzle.
know. The challenge is great. Making organization out of chaos. That's what I love about this.
Yep.
Absolutely. I pulled up the Norway emigration and immigration article on the FamilySearch Wiki.
It's awesome, huh?
Wow. It's so
Yeah.
fabulous. And I'll link to it in the show notes, but there are all kinds of lists of different online databases, resources by place within Norway, finding like ideas for records to look at to find the town of origin and all kinds of things. So this is a good resource.
Yeah, there's great stuff. I know that the folks who run those Scandinavian pages, they know their stuff. They're dynamite researchers. So I'll always give it a plug. I mean, these free resources, we don't have to pay a dime, and it's just so much good information.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on to help us answer our listeners' question. And
Oh, thanks for having me.
everyone listening who's doing research in Scandinavia got some great takeaways to go try. And it makes me want to get into our Scandinavian research on mom's side. So maybe I'll do that sometime. I kind of want to look at our DNA matches and see, if some of those provide clues to towns of origin. Of course, we already kind of have it traced back to their town of origin, but I'm just curious, like if I didn't know, would those matches give me clues to where to look? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah, it would be fun to add some DNA to that and see what could be discovered. That's a great idea.
Of course, it's always fun to merge the two, right? That's
what we like to do.
I know. You're like, I'm going to geek out over this line. It's going to be the best. I'm throwing DNA. I'm going to use all my charts.
Well, and I'm looking at my big pedigree chart here, and we do have back on the 6th great grandparents a big blank. So there's something that could be done. And these names are different. Like, I don't know, maybe they're common, Jenny. Kusk, Kusk.
Oh, no, that's not normal.
And Ladefoged, Ladefoged.
Yeah, that's more normal.
Is it? Okay. You can see I have no idea.
It's
like,
not the
weird.
patronymic surnames, but yeah, that works. I'm like, that sounds... Yeah.
I think the Kusk or the Kusk name was added to the Sorensen. So it was like a Peter Sorensen Kusk.
Okay. So then
like
that could...
where his farm was or something.
I was just going to say that. It could be a farm name.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, obviously we have some things to learn about our Danish line.
Well, thanks, Jenny, for coming. And we hope all our listeners had a great time. And we'll talk to you again next week.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at FamilyLocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.